Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Good morning, sir. Yes, you are audible.
Good morning,
Good
sir.
morning, yes. Good morning and good year.
Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And my screen is also visible to all of you, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, first of all, Happy New Year to all of you. And I wish all your dreams will fulfill in this year, right? So, because
Thank
this
you
is
very much.
yeah, welcome, welcome, guys. So, and I hope you have enjoyed your holidays, and I also hope that you are also in touch with our classes, right? Classes in the sense, whatever we have so far discussed, you have done the practices and understand the concept very well, right? So with this keep in mind, let us proceed and try to learn something new, right? Which is very interesting. In fact, if you understand the database first approach of entity framework, right, then it will not be that difficult, right? Because it is just another flavor. So you know ice cream, but in ice cream there are multiple flavors, right? And in the similar way, entity framework, the concept is going to be same. The way you are performing the CRUD operation, right? The same way you are going to perform the CRUD operation in every approach, but in a different style, in a different flavor, in a different manner, right? So we have already discussed the database first approach, and today we are going to start another that is code first approach. Code first approach. So let us start the discussion, right? So apart from that database first approach, code first approach, another approach is also there, that is model first approach. So basically we are having three different flavors, right? One is database first approach, second one is code first approach, and the third one is model first approach. We have already covered the database first approach, and we have discussed many different concepts, many different examples, how to work with the database first approach, how you can perform the CRUD operation, right? And what is the issue with the CRUD operation which is provided by NTB context class, how we can overcome those issues by using some third-party libraries, right? All these things we have covered so far, right? Let us try to focus on the code first approach. And if you guys remember, there are three different flavors, right? And we have already discussed when to use which database approach. So database first approach, if you need to use the database first approach if the database schema is already existing. Based on the database schema, then the required model classes are going to be created in the case of a database first approach. What is code first approach? We do not have the database ready. Schema is not defined. What exactly we want is, based on our model classes, we want to tell the entity, hey, Mr. Entity Framework, these are my model classes, right? Please create the necessary database and the tables as per my requirement. So for that purpose, we need to go with the code first approach. And code first approach is basically going to be used in domain driven applications, right? Domain driven application in the sense where the main important component is domain classes. Database is simply used for storing the data. We are not going to create any kind of trigger, any kind of a storage procedure, right? Any kind of additional activity on the database side. We are only going to use database to store the data. For that purpose, we need to use code first approach. But if you want to implement a trigger functionality, if you want to create storage procedure, use a database function and many database objects you want to create, then you should not go with the code first approach. In that case, you need to go with database first approach. Why you should not go with code first approach? That also I will explain. Right? And model first approach means what exactly this approach, as we already discussed. So we do not have the model classes, we do not have the database. We will have some designer interface, and inside that designer interface, we will create the model, right? Based on the model, our .NET classes is going to be generated. Based on the model, the corresponding database is also going to be generated, right? So these are the three different approaches, and we have already discussed this thing in one session, right? So please watch that session for more details when to use which approach, right? So today we are going to keep focus on the introduction part of Entity Framework Code First approach. What is Entity Framework Code First approach? How Entity Framework Code First approach is work, right? How to create application using Entity Framework Code First approach? What are the default convention of Entity Framework Code First approach? Everything we are going to discuss in today's session, right? So is that clear, guys?
Yep.
Yes.
So the first point here, it is saying that if you do not have an existing database, then only you need to go for code first approach. If I have already created one database with some database table, with some database views, some storage procedure, some storage function, some trigger, right? Then the code first approach should not be there. In that case, you need to use database first approach, right? So the code first approach you need to use only when you do not have an existing database, or if you have an existing database, but the database is one empty database. You simply create the database, and inside that database, nothing is there. No class, no tables, no views, no storage procedure, no functions, no trigger. Nothing is there inside that database. Simply an empty database. Then you can also use code first approach. So you have two options, right? So when to use means you have two options: no database or empty database. So in this case, you need to go with which approach? You need to go with code first approach. So this is the point that first of all you need to understand. Code first approach means if you do not have an existing database, no existing database, or empty database. Empty database means what? The database is completely empty. You only simply create the database, but nothing inside that database. So for that, in that case, you need to go with code first approach. In this approach, we will start developing our domain entities. So whenever I'm saying domain entities, you can consider these are domain classes. You can consider these are business classes. You can consider these are nothing but simply .NET classes, right? And context class, right? So you have, suppose you are developing one application for a school. Then for the school, what are the domain entities? For school, student is one domain entity, teacher is one domain entity, standard is one domain entity, course is one domain entity, right? These are nothing but your domain entities, or you can say domain classes, or simply you can say .NET classes. So these things is required. And most important thing is context class. So without context class, you cannot do anything using entity framework, because in the database first approach, we have already discussed the context class. The same context class we are also going to use with entity framework code first approach. The context class is the one which is going to be responsible for interacting with the database, right? If we want to add any entity, right, then we need to use context class. The same context class, all the method what we have discussed in the database first approach, the save changes method, right? We are also going to use the save changes method. The way we are creating an instance of the context class and using the DBset properties, right? Everything is going to be available in the inside the code first approach, right? So first of all, you should have some domain classes or domain entities. You should have the context class. So in this case, what we will do, so if you remember, in the database first approach, what exactly the entity framework does. So in database first approach, what exactly happening? Now, based on the database, right? Based on the database, two things are happening. Can anybody tell me what are the important things happening in the case of a database first approach? Right? Create, what it create models.
Create model.
Models means for database tables, right? For database tables and views, it will create a model, yes or no?
Yes.
And another class, what it create? Which class?
Context class.
And that context class is derived from which class?
DB context.
So these are the two class, these are the classes, and inside this context class, it might be create some function, right? Inside this context class, it might be create some functions, and based on database functions and storage procedures, right? So if you are having few tables, few views, right, then based on the tables and views which you have included while creating the context, right, while creating the EDMX file, then for each database table and view, it is going to create some models, and it will create a context class, and that context class is derived from the DB context class. Inside this context class, it will include these models as a DBset properties. Yes or no? So what you will find inside this model class? You will find some DBset of entity, DBset of student, right? You will find one property students. You will find DBset of what? Standard. These are the things you will find, or anything else?
Yes, we find these things.
Right, so here it will create one model for students and one model for standards, right? And these models are nothing but your class. Yes or no, guys?
Yes.
That means to work with in order to work with entity framework, you should have some model and you should have a context class. By default, if you are going with a database first approach based on the database, the entity framework API is going to create the models, or you can say entities, And then it is also going to create a context class where it configure or the models, right? Configure means it will register all the entity as DB set properties. It is also going to create some functions, right, based on the database function and storage procedure if you include. So this is the approach what we have discussed so far. And if you are going with the code first approach, then what you need to create the model classes, create model classes, right? Create model classes. Then you need to create the context class. This context class must and should be derived from which class?
Context.
DB context class. Clear? And inside this context class, you need to register model classes as DB set of the entity properties. Clear? Right? And once you have done this, then the way you are working with the entity framework, right? Creating an instance of an entity, adding that entity to the context class, calling the step changes method, right, of the context class instance, and then that entity is going to be added to the database table. That things is going to be same. What is the difference thing? Now in database first approach, based on the database schema, the things are going to be created automatically for us. But in this case, right, in the case of code first approach, first we need to create the model classes. Then we need to create a context class. That context class would be derived from the DB context class. Within this context class, we need to register the model classes as a DB set of the entity property. And when we run the application, the entity framework will check this context class. Right? Based on this context class, the entity framework, based on this context class, right? Based on this context class, entity framework API will create the database if not existing. Will create the database if not existing, right? And create the database tables, right? Entity framework API will create the database if not existing and create the database table. Also, if the database is already exist, right? If the database is already exist, then simply entity framework API, entity framework API add, okay, and create the database to entity framework API, add the database table with the existing database. Create or understand. Now, in this case, you might be have one existing database. If the database is already exists, then it is going to simply add the database table inside that database. If the database is not exist, right, then it will create the database and it will add the database table. This is the beautiness of entity framework API. It has the ability, it will identify whatever the database we are specifying, whether the database is exist in the database server or not. If the database is exist, right, then it will not create the database again. It will simply add the database table inside the database. If the database is exist, if not exist, then it will create the database and it will add the database. Then you might have one question. First of all, when I'm executing the application code for the first time, it will check, it will not find, it will create the database and it will execute, it will create the database table. Second time I'm running the application, second time it will check the database is exist, right? And in that case, it is going to, it will not create the database. But what happens if the model changes, right? Model changes. Model changes. Model changes means or you have created some model classes. Based on the model classes, right? It is going to create the database schema. It will create the database, create the database table. Model changes, what will happen, right? That is what we are going to discuss in detail. How to handle the model changes in Entity Framework API. This is the most important part, right? What happened? Sometimes what will happen if the you have many options, right? What you want to do when the model changes, what exactly you need to do? You need to drop and create the database. You do not want to allow the model changes, right? And every time you run the application, drop the database, create the database, right? There are three options are there. By default, once the database is created, model is created, you cannot change the model. That is one option. Second option, now when the model changes, right? So basically here we have three options. Don't allow model changes. Do not allow model changes. In that case, what you need, what it will do, throw exception. When model changes, throw exception. Second option, drop and create the database when model changes. This is another option. Third option is what? Now every time run the application, drop and create the data. Understand, guys?
Yes.
So
Yes.
you have three options, right? If you do not want once the database is created, you do not want to change the database. That means model changes you do not accept it. That is also possible, and this is the default behavior, right? And second option that I want to allow model changes, right? Whenever the model changes, I just need to drop the database and create the database. That option is also possible. Every time you run the application, you want to drop the database and create the database. That is also possible, right? But here again, you are having one problem. What problem? In this case, you will not face any problem. But in these two cases, you have two problems. You have one problem. What problem? Suppose, suppose you have created the database. Some data you stored in the database, right? Some tables are there. Those tables storing some data. If you drop the database, the data is going to be lost. In this case also, every time you run the application, whatever data stored in the database, that is what going to be lost. And for that purpose, we are having one concept called database DB migration, right? So DB migration means it will keep the old data and it will drop the data, it will store the data with the old data, right? So that option is also available. We will discuss all these things in detail one by one. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right? So now let us try to understand the working principle of Entity Framework Code First approach, right? So you can see, you can look at this image. So you are in your application, you are having few classes. Give me 1 minute.
There is some problem with the net. Not audible.
No, I just mute myself. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah. So you can say this is my .NET application and this is the database, right? So in my .NET in my .NET application, I have created few domain classes, or you can say entities. when I will say a domain class as entities, now whenever I will include this domain class as a DB set of T entity property inside the context, right? And when I include, then I can say that the class as an entity. So here I'm mentioning these are my domain classes as well as entities. I have created some classes, right? Inside a class, you can have some properties, you can have some method, right? These are the things you normally uh, created as part of the class, right? And then I'm having one context class. This is my context class, and this context class is derived from the DB context class, right? The way automatically entity framework create the class, in the same way, this context class we need to create, right? And inside this domain context class, you can also put filter properties method, right? If you remember in the database first approach, all the model classes are going to be created as a DP set of T entity properties. And if you remember, then based on the database storage procedure, storage functions, right? Those are going to be created as a method inside your context class, right? So these things you have to create here manually. Once you create the domain classes and once you create the context class, when you run the application, the entity framework API, right? The entity framework will come into the picture based on the context classes, right? He is going to create the database for us. The database is going to be created, the models, right? Whatever model we have created, those models are going to be created as your database table. And as I told you, remember, these things are going to be used, right? In this case, only for the storing purpose. For the storing purpose, we are going to use code first approach. We should not have that storage procedure functionality. We should not have that view. We should not have that storage function trigger. Nothing is going to be inside the database. Only database table are there, which is going to store the domain data, right? So basically, domain-centric application, right? If you are going to develop, then you need to go with this approach. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So,
Yes.
now, so what is the flow, right? What is the flow of entity framework code first approach, right? So first you need to create or modify the domain classes, right? Domain classes in the sense the pure .NET classes. First you need to create the .NET classes. Then you need to configure the domain classes, right? So you need to configure the domain classes in the sense you can configure the domain classes using Fluent API or data annotation attribute. We will discuss what is Fluent API, what is data annotation attribute, everything we are going to discuss. Then we need to create or update. I mean, once you configure the domain classes using Fluent API or data annotation attribute, then you need to create or update the database schema using automated migration or code-based migration, right? So once you have the domain classes, once you have configured the domain classes, then you need these domain classes to be updated in the database, right? To update the domain classes, right, in the database, you have two options. You can go with automated migration or code-based migration. So what is migration means? As I told you, right? So if you have some data, right, and if you do not use any kind of migration, right, then by default, every time you drop and create the database, the data is going to be lost, right? So that is how you are going to migrate the data. And based on this thing, the database is going to be created by the entity framework code, right? So every step, if these steps are not clear at the moment, right, don't worry. We will discuss what is Fluent API, right? We'll discuss what are data annotation, what is the difference between them. We will discuss automated migration. We'll discuss code-based migration, right? We'll also discuss how to create domain classes, how to modify the domain classes, how we can handle the domain class modification with entity framework code first approach. Everything we will discuss in detail one by one, right? So before proceeding further, few important point that you need to remember while working with entity framework code first approach, right? What are the important points? The entity framework could first approach target a database that does not exist, and entity framework could first will create the database and related table. So first option is that you do not have an existing database, right? And entity framework will create the database and the related table in the database. Second option is that entity framework code first approach can also be used with an empty database, right? If you remember, I have mentioned, right, two things here. If the database not existing, then it will create the database. And if the database is empty database, then also it is going to use that database, right? In this case, if not existing, then it will create the database and the related table. If the database exists, then it is going to simply use that database and create the database table inside that empty database. So these are the 2 points. It also allows to define domain classes, right? So the domain classes means what? .NET classes. As .NET classes, you can create the classes using C#.NET and VB.NET language, right? So as we are working with, we are learning C#.NET, so we are going to create the domain classes using C#.NET. It is also possible to provide additional configuration using attributes on our classes and properties or by using Fluent API, right? So if you remember here, this is the configure domain classes, right? So once you create a class, how you can configure the class? For configuring the class, we are having 2 options. Either we can go with the Fluent API or you can go with the data annotation attribute, right? Both the options we are going to discuss in detail. What is data annotation attribute, how to use data annotation attribute, right? Everything we are going to discuss in detail, right? So is that clear? The basic concept, how exactly the entity framework is going to work from a higher level point of view, right? From the internal, from the detailed, until and unless we are not doing the practical examples, you will not understand. But from a higher level point of view, you need to understand this picture. You should have some domain classes. You should have the context class. Based on the context class, right? Inside the context class, you need to register the domain classes. And once you register the domain classes, right, then based on the domain context object, right, based on the context class, the entity framework is going to create the required database. Again, if the database is not exist, then it will create the database, and inside that database, it is going to create the related database table. And if the database is already exist, then it will use that database, and inside that database, it is going to create the related database table. But from the beginning, you have to remember one thing, right? What is that thing? Now, if the database is empty or if the database is not existing, then only you need to go with the code first approach. But if you already created the database with some database table, some view, some storage procedure, then you should not use this code first approach. In that case, you need to go with the database first approach. Clear, guys?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Right. So let us try to understand this concept, right, with one example, right? First, you need to create, so as discussed, first you need to create your domain classes as per your business requirement. So for example, right, for example, you want to develop one school application, right? For the school application, what are the domain classes that you need to identify, right? If you remember in our OOPS concept, we started discussing from the entity. What are the entity required for your application? Then you need to identify the common entity. Then you need to identify the relationship on the entity hierarchy, right? Once you decide the entity hierarchy on which class, what is the relation, what is the prime, what is the superclass, what is the subclass, what are the things we need to put in the superclass, subclass, right? Everything once you define, those are nothing but your entity. So that is what it means, right? First, you need to create your domain classes as per your business requirement. What exactly you want to do, based on that, you need to create the domain classes. But guys, remember, these domain classes have nothing to do with entity framework. They are just the classes of your business domain, right? The context class of entity framework manages the interaction between the domain classes and your database, right? Already we have discussed in our database first approach, we know context class is the one which is going to interact with the database and with our .NET application. Context class makes the relation, makes a connection between our .NET class and the database, and then this context class allows us to perform the database crawl operation. The same thing is also here, right? The way the domain classes are nothing to do with entity framework, in the same way, the context class is not specific to code first approach. The context class is not specific to code first approach. This is one of the important classes of entity framework, and using this context class, we can interact with the database and we can perform the database crawl operation. The way we perform with the database first approach, in the same way, we are going to use the context class to perform the database crawl operation, right? So the entity framework code first approach allows us to create our domain classes first. So if you are going with the entity framework code first approach, first you need to create the domain classes, right? And based on the domain classes, entity framework generates the database automatically for us, right? So with this keep in mind, let us proceed and try to understand how to use code first approach with an example, right? Let me first create one application with the name. Let me open Visual Studio. Any version you can use. I'm creating a new .NET application, right? I'm selecting Visual C# console application. I'm providing the name as EF Code First Demo. I'm going to create this project in a different folder, right? Inside this folder, I'm creating this project, selecting the framework, latest framework 4.8. Click on the OK button, right? Once you click on the OK button, it will create one project. So this is the project, and inside this project, I'm going to show you everything using code first approach. The second important thing that what you need to do is you need to install entity framework, right? So next we need to install entity framework DLL, right? So how to install entity framework DLL? That is what we need to understand, right? So right. So right click on this here, and there is option, okay, solution. There is an option called manage NuGet packages for solution, right? You can click on this option. Okay, I'm showing you again. Right click on your solution. There is an option called manage NuGet package for solution. You can click on this option. Other option is also there from the tools menu, right? From the tools menu, you can go NuGet package manager, and here you can also find manage NuGet package for solution, right? Click on this link. Once you click on this link, right? If any DLL, right? If you have installed, then that is going to be shown in the install section. Currently, we have just created the default DLL are included. We have not installed any DLL from NuGet package, and that's why you can see no packages found. Go to the browse section, and here just type entity framework. Go to the browse section and just type entity framework, right? So here you can see there are many options available, right? So there are many options available, and this is the version which we are interested, right? We are not interested for entity framework core because that is a different story altogether. We are interested for .NET framework and .NET entity framework, right? So you have to select this version, entity framework by Microsoft, right? 193 million downloads are already done, right? And here, once you select, and here it's showing entity framework is a tried and tested, means it is already tested by the team for ORM, right? Object relational mapping for .NET with many years of feature development and stabilization, right? Means it is a tested framework. You can use this framework, right? Which is saying by the Microsoft, right? So there is no second thought of using Entity Framework. It's the best one, right? So once you select this one, then you have to choose on which project you want to install this Entity Framework, right? Currently, you can see we have only having one project within this solution. It might be possible that inside this project, multiple solutions are there. You want to add this Entity Framework DLL in all the project inside the solution, only one project. It might be possible that you have created one solution with 5 projects, right? One console application, one class library project, one MVC application, another console application, one WCF application, one Windows Form application, one web application, web API project, one MVC project. Many projects you might be created inside a single solution. Then in this section, it will show you all the listed projects. And then you need to select on which project I'm going to use Entity Framework, right? That project you need to select. So now I'm going to select this project. And once you select, right, then based on the entity, based on the .NET framework, right? If you are using the latest .NET framework, then you can select the latest. But if you are using the earlier, older .NET framework, then you need to check for that .NET framework, which version of Entity Framework is compatible. And then from this drop-down list, you need to choose the appropriate one. But I'm going with the latest one. I'm selecting the latest because I'm going to show you some advanced feature, right, which are not available in earlier version. That is the reason why I'm selecting the latest one. And going further, I will also show you whenever I'm discussing the features of Entity Framework, then I will show you that this feature is available in the latest version of Entity Framework. This is not available in Entity Framework 5. This is available in Entity Framework 6. Those things I'm going to cover in our coming session. So for that purpose, I'm selecting the latest version of Entity Framework, that is 6.4.4, and just click on the install button. Once you click on the install button, it will ask you to accept the license, right? So because this is the following package require that you accept their license terms before installing. And this is going to be provided by Microsoft. And as this is not available as part of your PCL, right? If you remember from the day one, I'm saying whenever we install .NET Framework, 2 things are installed. One is base class library, and the second one is CLR, right? So, and this is not available as part of a PCL. That is the reason why we are installing this additionally. And if you are installing some DLL additionally using NuGet Package Manager, then you have to accept their license, right? So simply click on this I accept button. And once you click on the I accept button, then it will take some time, and then it will install the DLL, right? And once the installation completed, then you can see here we have 2 options, output and error list. Click on the output and see finished. Finished means it is successfully installed the .NET Framework, which version is 6.4.4, right? And now you can also check the same, right? Go to the reference folder, and there is DLL called the Entity Framework. Right click on this, right click on that DLL Entity Framework and click on the properties. And here you can see the latest version 6.0.0. So here it is only showing the version number. It is not showing the what we can say the rest of the thing. Rest means it is not showing the 6.4.4. It is only showing the Entity Framework 6, right? So Entity Framework is installed, right? And it is not available as part of the PCL. Why and how I'm saying that? If you right click and if you click on the add references folder, right, then here you can see framework extension recent, right? So framework means whatever available as part of your PCL, those are going to be shown here. But here you will not find Entity Framework, and this is the reason why we have installed Entity Frameworks separately, right? So once you install the Entity Framework, right, then you can also check the package config, right? Inside this package config, you can see on that package what you have installed additionally that is showing here, right? In this case, you can see the package name is ID is Entity Framework. Which version of Entity Framework you have installed? I have installed 6.4.4. And what is the target.NET Framework? The target.NET Framework is 4.8, right? And if you go to the what I can say app config file, then you can also see the Entity Framework section. This is the Entity Framework section, right? So here you will see version is 6.0.0, right? This is the Entity Framework main version, right? What is the public key? So see guys, if you are confusing what is culture neutral, what is public key token version, right? So I'm not explaining these things at this time because different story altogether available, right? In our comment sessions, right? We'll discuss this thing in detail. If you open the course syllabus, right? So in this time, we will discuss what is strong and weak name assembly. What are the four parts, four things available as part of one assembly, right? All these things we are going to discuss. What is delay, how to convert a strong assembly to a, how to convert a weak assembly to a strong assembly. For qualifying for strong assembly, what are the things are required, right? Everything we are going to discuss in detail, right? So for that purpose, I'm not explaining this thing now. And what is this version, right? What is this culture neutral? What is public key token? Everything we are going to discuss in detail, right? So you can verify the Entity Framework DLL here. What is the Entity Framework version? You can all check in the app config and in the package config file. So once you have installed the Entity Framework, the next thing is how to use the Entity Framework, right? So using Entity Framework is very simple, right? You do not need to do anything special. The way we have if you remember, right, if you understand the database first approach, then understanding Entity Framework code first approach is not that difficult. Let us understand how to use Entity Framework with one application. Let's assume that we are going to develop one school application for some school, let's say Xavier International School, or let's say a DAV Public School, or let's say some XYZ school, right? And what is the purpose of this application? The user of this school application should have the ability to add or update student, to add or update standard, teacher, course information, right? So this is the basic information I'm providing here, but you can check, right? You can take the requirement from the school, right? What exactly their business requirement, and based on those requirement, you can create the entities, right? But for now, let's assume we are having these four entities. But instead of, right, so we are going to use the code first approach. Code first approach means we should start developing from the model classes. We should not start developing from the database. First, we will create our .NET application, then Entity Framework based on our .NET application going to create the database, right? So instead of designing the database first, right, let us start creating the domain classes as and when needed. I'm not going to create all the domain classes at this point, right? We will, as we progress in this course, as and when required, I'm going to add the related entities or related classes, right? So let us first create the student and standard classes where every student is associated with one standard. Every student is associated with one standard means what kind of a relationship, guys?
One-to-one relationship.
One-to-one relationship. And one standard can belongs to many students. So one standard can belongs to many students means it is going to be one-to-many relationships, right? So for that purpose, let us create two classes, right? So student class, let me create a class called student.cs. How to create classes, you know, right? Student.cs. I have created this class, right? Then what I'm trying to do, I'm going to copy paste these things. Okay, let me create another class, then I will explain the code. Right. So if you see, this is my student class. I have created the student with some, okay, so let me put something like this. Right. So I have created the student ID, first name, last name, date of birth, photo, height, weight, and one standard property. Let me put this thing inside the first name, last name below here. Let me also add another property called ID. Right. So many things I will explain here. Okay. So this is my student entity and our student model class, or you can say student class. So this student class having first name, last name, student ID, date of birth, photo, height, weight, and the standard, right? So in this case, you can see this is my, which reference? This is my reference navigation property. So this is my reference navigation property, and each student can have a standard. That means in this case, student having one-to-one relationship with the standard. Clear? Any question from this model class? Guys?
No, clear, looks good.
Okay. So this is my standard entity, right? And in this case, you can see standard ID, standard name, description, and here I'm having a collection navigation property. Collection navigation property, right? So, and in this case, one standard can have multiple students. So this is the meaning of this, and that means here the standard entity having one-to-many relationship with the student entity. Clear, guys? Yes or no?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, clear.
So if you remember database first approach, then in that case, the entity provider create one partial class, right? They have made this property as virtual, right? And in this case, I'm also doing the same thing, but I'm not creating this class as a partial. So public class student, and I'm having these properties, and this is my reference navigation property, and the same thing is also here. And here I'm not making this as a virtual, because making this as virtual is optional. If you make this as virtual, fine. If you remove virtual, then that is also fine. So we have created our model classes. So in this case, we are representing one-to-many relationship. One student having one standard, and one standard can have multiple students, right? So once you have the model classes, then what you need to create? Tell me, guys, your model classes is ready. What are the model classes you have created? You have created student and a standard. Then the next important class, what we need to create? We need to create the context class, and that context class would inherit from your DB context class. And within that DB context class, we need to register DB set of properties. DB set of properties. In this case, what should be the DB set of properties? DB set of a student, right? And the DB set of what? DB set of standard. Clear? Yes or no?
Yes.
Right? So let's do these steps also, right? So let me create a context class with the name, any name you can give, right? I'm going to use EF code first context, right? And this context class, nothing to do with the entity framework, any approach, right? So this context class is common, right? Common in the sense this context class is not specific to code first approach or not specific to database first approach. Context is an independent class. Whether you use code first approach, database first approach, model first approach, context class is mandatory. And this context class is responsible for interacting with the database, and this context class is responsible for performing the database CRUD operations, right? So guys, remember, so if you remember here, I'm creating a class inheriting from the DB context class. Intentionally, if you go to the DB context class, right, then you will see there are many overloaded portions, right? We are having some DB context class, which is taking the either the name of the connection string or the connection string itself as a parameter. But here, I'm going to use the constructor which doesn't take any parameter. So in this case, you can see I'm calling this parameterless constructor from my context class, and this is the required. And what is the reason we have already discussed, because the context class should know where the database is, right? That database information should know, should have this context class. Until and unless the context class doesn't know where the database server is, what is the database is, then how you can perform the database CRUD operation. That information we need to provide through the constructor. But guys, remember, in this case, we are not providing anything, right? We are not providing either the connection string name, right? Or we are not also providing the connection string itself, right? Nothing is provided here. Intentionally, I'm not providing anything. Later, I will show you how to provide the connection string information, right? So in this case, the constructor is there. And then I'm adding these domain classes as DBSet properties. And you know these things, right? Because until and unless we have not added this DBSet, we have not registered our model classes, then the entity framework, right? The entity framework will not track the entities, right? In this case, if I remove this standard property, then this standard for this standard entity framework is not going to create a class. It is not going to create the related database table. We want to create a table for student entity. We want to create a table for standard entity. And then using these standard students and standard properties, we need to perform the CRUD operation. For that purpose, you need to register your model classes as part of your context class using a DBSet of a T-entity property. Clear? So these things we have already discussed, so I'm not going in detail, right? So once you create the context class, and once you have the standard entity, and once we have the student entity, then what we need to do, right? So then we need to create an instance of the context class, and whatever operation you want to do, you can do, right? So basically, let's assume, let's create a student entity, and let's create a student entity and store that student entity into the database, right? If you go to the definition of student entity, there is something called first name, last name, student ID, date of birth, photo, height, weight, standard, many things are there. So now I'm simply providing the first name, I'm providing the last name, I'm creating the student entity. In this case, rest of the property will take the default value, right? And then once you create the context object, right? And if you want to add the student, then inside this context class, there is a student property. And using that student's property and using the add method, you can add the student, you can call the step changes method. And once you call the step changes method, right, the student entity will be in added state. Because why? Now, whenever we add one entity to the using the add method, then by default that entity is going to be in added state. And once the entity is in added state, right? Whenever you call the step changes method, then what SQL script is going to be generated by the entity framework? Add, update, or delete. Which script is going to be generated? Guys?
Insert.
Yes, insert script is going to be generated. And if everything is fine, then you will see student added message on the screen. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So let's run the application. Okay. I understand why I'm getting this error, because I have already okay. So you can see the message student added is shown. That means everything is fine. Now the student is added and you can see that message. But the thing is that where the database is. We provide any connection string or any information, the context class related to the database? Yes or no? Guys, do we provide any information about the database server, about the connection string to the DB context class? Guys,
No.
no. Then where the database is going to be created? Do you think that the database is going to be created in the SQL Server database, or it is going to created in the MySQL database, or it is going to created the database in Oracle? Where the database, what is the database IP, what is the server name? Nothing. We have not provided anything. Say AP, you do not provide anything, then by default it is going to create the database in the local database, right? So to view the local DB, what you need to do, local SQL server it is going to use. So to view the local DB, what you need to do, you need to click on the view option. You can see in the menu file, edit view. You have to click this view option, and here you will find SQL Server Object Explorer. Just click on that. And once you click on this option, right, then you will see that option here, SQL Server, right, my MS SQL DB, right? So you can see MS SQL local DB, SQL Server, this version, right? So inside this MS SQL local DB, you will find the database, right? Let me refresh the database, right? So you can see this is nothing but your database. What is the name? What is the name of the database? The database name is nothing but your namespace name followed by the context class name. Is that same? EF code first demo, EF code first demo dot EF code first context. Is the name is same? Yes. This is the default name which is provided is nothing but your EF code first demo, the namespace name, and the class name of your context class. This is the name. And inside this database, how many entities you have added in the context class? two entities.
Two.
One name is students and another name is standards, right? So inside this table, right? So you will find students and standards and migration history. This is a different table. We have not created this one, but what is the use of this table? Later I will show you. But for now, you can focus on these two database tables, standard and a student, right? So what it means if you have not provided any information, right, then you can create the local database. Before some time, someone having some issue, right? Someone having some issue to install SQL Server on their local machine, then they can use this local database, right? And if you use this one, if you go to the properties, right? Right? Right, so you can use this data. So you can see all the information it is available. It is providing here, right? So instead of using your, if you are unable to install, right? If you are unable to install SQL Server on your machine, then you can also use this local database to perform the CRUD operation, right? So I'm going to show you both the options, right? Whichever option is suitable to you, you can use that option, right? It is possible to use local database to do the demos. Again, later I will show you how to create the database in the SQL Server database. Both the options, that what I'm going to show you, right? So where the database is created, already we have discussed. The question that should come to your mind is where the database is created, and the database is created in the local database, SQL Server local DB, right? And how you can view SQL Server Object Explorer. And in this case, this is nothing but your database server. This is nothing but your database. And this is nothing but your standard table. And this is nothing but your student table. And inside the standard table, you can check the columns property, right? So you can see inside my standard, I'm having standard ID, standard name, and standard description. These three properties are created, right? And inside the student, you can see I'm having this 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, for this standard and for this reference navigation property, it is going to create another foreign key column, right? So in this case, you can see ID, first name, last name, student, all these things, and this is my reference navigation property, right? How these properties are created, how these properties are mapped, right? How he makes the standard ID and here ID as the primary key, how it will create this as a foreign key. That is what we are going to discuss next. But for now, you can see this is the things which is going to be created by the entity framework, right? Based on our model classes and the configuration, what we have provided for the model classes inside this entity framework code first approach, the related database and the tables are going to be created. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Right? So next, what we are going to discuss, the conventions, right? The default conventions. Default conventions means how it created this foreign key table, how it created the standard ID as the primary key. What is the order of these columns, right? Everything we are going to discuss in detail, right? So let me open that also. Right, so conventions, because understanding the conventions is also important, because how the data type is decided, right? How it will make this column, if you see okay, if you see some of the columns are not null, some of the column are null, how it identify this data type is going to be varchar, how it is going to be date type. So these are the things that you need to understand, right? In entity framework code first approach, the conventions, right? So this is nothing but the default conventions which is followed by entity framework, right? Once you understand the default conventions, then we can also modify the default conventions. That is what we are going to discuss next, and that is possible by using two concepts. One is using data annotation attribute, another one is using Fluent API, right? But for now, we just need to keep focus on the default conventions, right? So based on this standard, based on the student table, how these things are created, right? That is what we are going to discuss. So the conventions are nothing but a set of a default rules. So in the case of a convention, this is nothing but default rules which is followed by the entity framework, which is automatically configure a conceptual model on your domain classes, right? So conventions are nothing but, so here you need to understand three things. One is conceptual model, one is domain classes, and these conventions, right? So in this case, this is nothing but my model class. This is nothing but my conceptual model or database model, right? And based on the concept, right, based on this model class, this database conceptual model is created. But how this is created? This is created based on some conventions. Then what is convention? Conventions are nothing but rules and regulations, right? Based on those rules and regulation, the student class and these related properties are created as a database table and column in the database, right? That is the meaning of this statement, right? So conventions are nothing but set of default rules which automatically configure a conceptual model. Conceptual model means database table. So you can say database based on your domain classes. We have created one example, right? And we have said entity framework configure the, and we can see entity framework configure the primary keys, entity framework configure the foreign keys, entity framework configure the relationship between the table, appropriate data type of the column, etc. You can see. So it is making the primary key foreign key, means it is maintaining the relationship between these two tables. It is making the primary key, it is making the foreign key, it is deciding the appropriate column name, right? What should be the column name? What is the data type of the column? Whether it is a null type or nullable type, right? Everything it is going to discuss, right? So how? So how it is mapping all these things? How it is creating this column as the primary key, how it is creating this as the foreign key, how it is maintaining the primary key and foreign key relationships, right? Everything is implemented by some conventions. Right? Some conventions means entity framework conventions, right? And entity framework having the default conventions, that is what we will discuss now, and how we can overcome or override those default conventions using data annotations and Fluent API. That is what we are going to discuss next, right? Let me explain these things first, right? So first, what are the default entity framework or first conventions, right? Schema. Right, schema means if you see by default entity framework will use the schema as a DB, right? So if you check the student database table or standard database table, so those are created with the schema DBO, right? DBO.standard, DBO.student. So these are the default conventions, right? Default schema followed by entity framework, right? So based on your entity model, this conceptual model is created with the schema DBO by DBO. Later, I will show you how you can change these conventions, right? How you can change the schema from DBO to admin, so super admin, some XYZ, some P keyword schema you want to provide. Yes, that is possible. How? That we will see later. But for now, the default schema, which is followed by entity framework, is DBO, DBO.standard, DBO.student, DBO.migration history. Clear, guys? Guys, clear?
Yes.
So what is the default
Yes.
schema? Okay. So, and next, if you see whatever the property name, whatever the entity name, it will pluralize that entity while generating the database table. It will pluralize that entity while generating the database table. What is the entity name here? Standard. What is the entity name here? Student. What is the table name here? Students. What is the table name here? Standard. That means this is the default conventions. Default conventions means if the table is already in plural form, that is fine. But if the if the model is already in plural form, then that is fine. But if the model is in singular form, then while creating the database table, it is going to generate the table in the plural form. But if you do not want it, you do not want to create the table as students, you only want to create the table as student, that is also possible. You want to create the student, you want that table names is my model name is student, but I want the table that name should be student details, that is also possible. And for that, what we need to do, we need to overcome this default table naming conventions. That is also possible. Then what is the default table name convention? The default table name convention is it will pluralize the model name while generating the database table. Clear? Guys?
Yes.
So
Yes.
students, and here standard means it is going to be standard. Right? So you can see this is the student name and the table primary key. So it is important to understand, right? So by default, Entity Framework API will look for a property name which name is ID, or it will look for a property name whose name is your model name plus ID. So if your model name is standard and if it will add ID, then is there any property with the name standard ID? Yes, there is a property called standard ID. Then by default, it will make that property as your primary key. Now coming to this part. So it will look for a property whose name is ID. Is there any property with the name ID is there? Yes, ID. Is there any property whose name is your model name plus ID? Yes, there is also a property called student. In this case, we do not have any ID column. This is the reason why it will make this property as primary key. But in this case, we are having student ID, student plus ID, and we are also having a property called ID. So we are having two options. Then by default, it will select this as the primary key. If this property is not there, then it will create student ID as the primary key. But if student ID is not there, then no issue. ID is going to be primary key. But if ID is there, if ID is there, means it is going to be primary key. It doesn't matter whether you are having this property or not. So this property is going to be primary key. So the first priority is given to ID. Then the second priority is given to your model name plus ID. In this case, ID is not there. So student ID is going to be your primary key. So you can see, so this is nothing but your primary key PK. Clear? And in this case, we are having student ID, and you can see the ID is going to be your primary key. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So next one is foreign key. So foreign key, in the sense, it will okay. So in the case of a foreign key, first of all, you should have the reference navigational property. So in this case, we are having this reference navigational property here. So it doesn't matter, it will not check for the collection navigation property. It will check for the reference navigational property. Is there any reference navigational property in this class? Guys?
Yes.
So
Standard.
this is standard reference navigational property is there. So once this property is there, then it will go to that, then it will check what is the primary key or inside that standard entity. Standard ID is the primary key, right? Then it will check, is there any standard ID property in this model class? Is there any standard ID property in this model class? No.
No.
If no standard ID property is model class, then what it will do, it will take the standard, it will take this class name standard, and it will take this class, this property name standard ID, and it will by default create the reference. I mean, it will create the foreign key with this name. So in this case, there is no standard ID property. So, but as this standard property is there, this is a reference navigation property. So it is going to create the foreign key with the name standard underscore standard ID. Is there any property in the students table with the name any column with the name standard underscore standard ID? Yes. And what is it is mentioned FK? FK means foreign key. Clear?
Yes.
But guys, but remember, if this property is there, right? But in this case, instead of this, if you have created this one, then what will happen? Give me 1 minute, guys. Right. So in this case, if you are having the standard navigation property, and if you are having the standard ID property, so in this case, it will create the reference navigation property as standard ID, not standard underscore standard ID. In the case, if this property is not available, then in that case, it is going to create the property as standard underscore standard ID. Clear? And we will discuss this thing in detail in our coming session, right? In our coming session, we will discuss these things in detail, because in our coming session, we will discuss everything in detail. We'll discuss primary key for one session in detail, foreign key one in detail. Many data annotation attributes are there. Everything we are going to discuss in detail. So, but for now, if this is not available, the property name is going to be this. If this is available, the property name is going to be standard ID. Clear?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this is your reference. This is your foreign key. Null and not null columns, right? By default, Entity Framework API will create a null column, right, for all reference type. So null means what, right? So null and not null. Null means what? That if you are creating a reference type. So null means, first of all, you need to understand whichever data type holds the null value. If I am creating one employee class, is it going to hold a null value?
No.
Yes or no?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
reference type means any user defined classes. Even if you created the data type as string, string is a class. Can you store null value in a string?
Yes.
Right? But for not null means primitive data types. If I'm creating some variable called integer or float, are they going to hold a null value?
No.
No, right? So, but if I want to store null, but if I'm using nullable data type, is it going to hold a null value?
Yes.
Right? So the same thing is going to be followed here, right? So if you check the student entity, right? So you can see student ID integer, ID integer, ID means it is not null. Student ID means it is not null. First name, last name, what is the data type? String. String means this is going to be null. Clear? Date of birth, right? Date of birth, you can see I'm seeing here null. Why? Because I have put this question mark, right? Photo, byte array. So this is the default value is going to be null. Height, I'm putting this nullable, so height is also going to accept null value. Float means I'm not putting this nullable or I'm not putting this question mark, then can I store null value inside this float variable?
No.
So in that case, you can see for this weight, it is saying not null. And the reference navigational property, it is going to be null, right? Because why? Because it's a standard. Standard means it's a reference type. Reference type means it can hold null. Clear?
Yes.
So whichever data type is going to be created as null, not null, that you can decide here, right? And this is the default conventions, right? Later you can also change this convention. That is what we are going to also discuss in detail, right? So these are the things. Database column order, right? So the way, okay, database column order means, let me first remove this one because this is not part of our model. So the order is going to be same, right? In the way you have created your model class. So in this case, first name, last name, students, you can see this order and you can see this. The order is going to be same except the primary key. Whichever is the primary key, that will come first, and the rest of the order is going to be same. So in this case, whichever is the primary, which property is the primary key, so ID is the primary key. So in this case, so you can say, let me put this as the first place. If I'm not putting, then also fine. But after the ID, and you can see rest of the columns are going to be same. First name, last name, student ID, date of birth, height, all these things. Clear? Order is order is not that important, but if you know, if you remember, that is fine. So the way, the order in which you have added the properties inside your model class, in the same order, the columns are going to be created in the database, except the primary key column. Primary key column is going to be the first column in your table. Clear? Clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Properties mapping, right? So properties mapping means, right? So in this case, if you see, every property is mapped. Every property is ID, first name, last name, student ID, DOB, photo, height, weight. Every property is mapped to their corresponding database column, right? If you don't want to map any property, right? Suppose you don't want to map the student ID property, then you have to decorate this with not mapped, right? Not mapped attribute, right? So what is this not mapped? I'm going to discuss later. So not mapped, right? So, and once you decorate this attribute with the student ID, then the student ID is not going to be created as part of your database, right? Not mapped. And here you have to remember this. So C# data type and the mapping to SQL Server data type. Now, if you are creating integer, it will be created as integer. If you are creating string, then it will be created as nvarchar max, right? So if you remember, right? So if you remember, first name and last name are string. String means what is the data type of the corresponding SQL server, nvarchar max, right? Later I will show you how to create, how to provide the length of a data type. That is also possible. We'll discuss those things later. But by default, it is going to be created as nvarchar of max, right? For decimal, float, byte, right? You can see for byte, for photo for var binary max, right? For decimal, where is the decimal data type? Decimal data type, it is created 18.2, right? For floating data type weight, it is creating a real, right? So you can see these are the corresponding date of birth, it is creating the date time, right? Date time here, it is also date time here. So you can check this image and you can understand. If I am creating a Boolean type variable here, then the data type is going to be bit in my database, right? If I'm creating date time byte array, var binary, float, real, decimal 18.2 string, and marker max integer as integer. And if you are using some char aspect object, then there is no map. It is not going to create any database column for those for those properties whose data type is going to be character, aspect, or object. Clear? And for byte, it is going to use tiny int, short, small int, long, big int. For double, it is going to use float data. Okay. So don't be confused. For float, it is going to create real, and for double, it is going to create float. Don't consume. The people are getting confused. Sir, I'm creating here float, but it is not created as float. This is the convention which we cannot change, right? For this data type, these are the .NET data type, and these are the SQL Server data type. Clear? And one more thing, so using this only, we can represent the one-to-many relationships, right? Many-to-many, one-to-one, this is not possible, right? Using this default convention, right? You can see I'm having one-to-many relationship between the student and the standard entity, right? But if you remember how to implement a one-to-one relationship, right? So if I'm making the key as the foreign key as well as the primary key, then that will be created as one-to-one relationship. And if we are creating some if you remember, if we are creating one database with two columns, right, which is the primary key pointing to the foreign key of a different table, right, then that is going to be created as many-to-many relations. But by default, this is not possible using Entity Framework Code First approach. But this is possible. For that purpose, what are the things we need to do, that we will discuss, right, in detail. So this is the default conventions that Entity Framework follow. And if you have not provided the connection string information or database information, by default, it is going to use the SQL Server local DB. You can see this is my SQL Server and this is my local DB. And inside this local DB, this is my database folder, right? And inside this database folder, this is going to be your system database, right? If you remember, master model, MSDB, TempDB, right? These are the system database. And this is nothing but the database which is created by the Entity Framework, right? And this class, right, this database name is nothing but your namespace name of your context class, followed by the dot operator with the context class. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Right?
Actually, I'm having one doubt.
Yes.
Okay, the local DB, in the sense, can we see the same database in the MS SQL SSMS tool?
No, you cannot see. If you are able to see in SSMS tool, then what is the meaning of this local DB? You cannot. So MS, if you cannot view this using SSMS tool.
Okay, in the local DB, in the sense, what type of DB it is? So whenever I was installing
See,
MS SQL.
No. If you have not, so in this case, this is my MS SQL Server, right?
Okay.
So this is my MS SQL Server. I have installed MS SQL Server on my machine, so I can create these things, right? Whatever options available, I can do this thing. So this is completely separate. For this, you need to install SQL Server. You need to make sure service is running using SSMS tool. You can access this database, right? And this is as part of your .NET framework only. As part of a Visual Studio only, you can access this.
Okay, fine.
There is no link between this SQL Server local DB with the local DB what I'm showing. Right here, you can see the system database. It's the same thing. The structure is going to be same, but this is local. For this, you do not need to install SQL Server on your machine. You do not require SSMS tool. Nothing is required. You can directly go to your view and you can find this option.
Okay.
Right. Any question from anyone? Nice.
For me,
Sir,
no.
Yeah.
I have a question, but I think I have to wait for last. When we deploy the project, so we have to create a connection string or not over the server.
So connection string means, as I mentioned, many options are there, right? You can put the connection string in the configuration file, right? So you are having this config section, right? Inside this configuration section, right? You have one section for config section. So inside this config section, you can create the connection string.
No, sir. Here I am asking about when we use the code first. So then
Sorry?
our database.
So sorry, whatever you were saying, code first, yeah, what?
When we are using code first method. So
Code first. Code first,
yes,
right?
yes,
Yes.
yes. So then this database will create on the local machine. But when we are gonna to apply deploy the project over the server. So what where we can access the database?
See, what is the meaning? What is the name of this database? Local DB. This database is only for what purpose? For the testing purpose. You cannot deploy this on the server. For the server, you have to create the database on the SQL Server database or any other database. That is what we are going to discuss next. For the practice purpose, that is fine. If you do not have that flexibility, SQL Server is not installed on your machine, but you want to do practices, right? Then local DB is fine. But for the production, you have to create the database, right?
First, I have to create the database, or then after we will connect with the code first, right?
Why? So I have told you, you have both options available. What are the options? If the database is not existing, then it will create the database. If the database is exist, then it will use the database.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Right? So
Yes.
as of now, I am only showing you how to create the database on your local DB. I have not shown you how to create the database in the SQL Server. That is the main objective, right? I'm going to show you how to create the database in the SQL Server database. How you will provide the, how you will provide the connection string details, right? How you will provide the database name, right? How you are going to provide the IP address, SQL Server authentication details. Everything is going to be provided, right? And when you deploy those things on the database.
Yeah. So that's why I'm saying I will have to wait at the last.
Yeah. So in this example, I'm only showing you the case of SQL Server locally, because if I'm not wrong, few people or someone saying me that I'm not having that flexibility to install SSMS on my office laptop. I cannot do practices. And this is the reason why I'm showing this example. Yes, if SQL Server you are unable to install on your machine, then you can still use the SQL Server locally.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Right? Okay. Yeah. Any question from anyone else? Guys?
No.
Who is Somesh?
Hi, sir.
Hi. What is your actual name?
Somshekhar.
You have registered for this batch?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you have any, you are a new student or you are the older one?
New.
New. Okay.
From December.
Okay, fine. So new means I need to check. Okay, fine. You have any question?
No.
And you have got
Sir, before have you discussed about solid principles and design patterns?
No. Those are going to be covered in detail. So once we cover the entity framework and the LDQ, then we are going to start design patterns and solid principles.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any question from anyone else? Okay.
No.
Okay, fine. So that's it for today. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.